what are you going to do is have like 50 wars around the world to discipline the third world? It's not going to happen anymore. I think that period has by and large come to a close. And I think the West has to understand that it's merely a group of countries in the world. Nothing special about the United States. It's just one among the 190 odd countries in the world. They need to realize that it's not a city on a hill. It's just a country. Relax. You're just another country.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today by Vijay Prashad, who is an Indian historian, journalist, and an academic. He was a professor of international studies at Trinity College, Connecticut, and is the author of 40 books, including Red Star Over the Third World and The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. His latest book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power, was written with Noam Chomsky. He currently serves as executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay is a public intellectual, and I consider him, together with people like Noam Chomsky, Yanis Varoufakis, Jeremy Corbin, as one of the leaders of the global left, who's pointing the finger at where it actually hurts, that colonialism never really ended, and the majority of today's wars are still the outcome of imperial Western politics. And Vijay, you correct me if that is wrong, but that's how I perceive you. So thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, listen, Pascal, it's a pleasure, and happy to talk to anybody who's domiciled in Japan. So great to be with you.
Thank you very much. So, Vijay, you've written so much about world politics, and you've especially looked at the third world, and I'm putting it in quotes because the third world, the term itself, comes out of the non-aligned states, right, who literally wanted to be neither of the two. And where do you see the third world today, and countries that try not to be sucked into this new Cold War that's unfolding in front of our eyes?
We're in a really difficult situation. Just a few days before we are now talking, Pascal, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a summary document, which if you haven't read it, I recommend you not read it because it's really scary. I mean, it's chilling, what they show, that the question of the climate catastrophe is accelerating. That's one problem. Every year, UN agencies such as the UN Development Program, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, even the International Monetary Fund, every year they release reports about growing social inequality in the world, deepening inequality, terrible inequality, billions of people having a hard time finding food every day, not millions, not hundreds of millions, but billions. That's the judgment of the Food and Agriculture Organization, of the UN and the UN's food program, World Food Program, WPF. Given the climate catastrophe, the growing inequality, the despair in the world, you'd think this is a great opportunity for leading powers of the world to come together, to use multilateral institutions like the UN in good faith, attempt to broker a deal, listen to each other's national interests, the insecurities that countries are facing and so on. But in fact, we're going in the opposite direction. We're going in a direction of greater confrontation and less collaboration. Even the pandemic didn't provoke countries to greater collaboration. Half the countries on the African continent spent more paying off their debts during the pandemic than they did on healthcare. You'd have thought that at that point, wealthy bondholders would have been told, wait, guys, let's first take care of the pandemic. Your profits come later. And by the way, when Credit Suisse got into trouble, the regulators had no problem telling the wealthy bondholders, we're going to do a haircut. You're going to lose your money. Grade A bondholders were basically told, sorry, you get out of the line. We're not going to pay you, and there's going to be some legal repercussions for both the Swiss government and UBS, which has absorbed Credit Suisse. So at a time of a banking crisis, they're okay to tell wealthy bondholders, you're out of the queue. But during the pandemic, they still allowed wealthy bondholders to claim wealth from African countries. Now, given this confrontation, given this lack of concern for the climate catastrophe, for social inequality, and so on, it's no wonder that increasingly countries in the global south, the third world, and so on, are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to line up behind the West, or we don't even want to line up behind Russia or anybody. We want to operate on the basis of our national interests. And if our national interests, for instance, the Indian government, a good test case, if our national interests mean that we're going to continue to trade with Russia during this war, we're going to do it. What can you do about it? This is our national interest. It's not our national interest to sanction Russia at this time. In fact, the government of Japan, in a similar way, said we're not going to actually slice our energy agreements with the Russian government. The Sakhalin-2 project, for instance, in which Japan has a very large financial stake, it's not cutting that stake. Japan joined the G7 statement condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine, but it didn't cut Sakhalin-2. I noticed that immediately. So what we're seeing countries of different kinds, not only struggling countries, but also OECD countries like Japan, essentially say, look, our national interests are important. We don't want to be sucked into what they see, and I think rightly, as an ideological conflict, a conflict around ideology, around political power. They don't want to damage further their economic situation in order to help maintain the Western countries as the dominant countries in the world. So I think that to a great extent, helps us understand why many countries seem to now be saying, look, I'm not sure I want to really get involved in this conflict like you want me to.
The ideological spin that especially the West put on the current war in Ukraine is tremendous, right? It's again good against evil from the Western perspective, right? Just as it was good against evil when the US had to justify its war in Iraq, just as every single war you fight is always good against evil, right? Otherwise you don't go to war. And neutral countries and non-aligned countries and the third world, they always have the same problem that they need to explain to both of these also publics. And that's what we are doing, right? We are talking to the publics of the US, Europe, Russia, and maybe even China to tell them, look, why you are on neither side. How do you approach that problem? I saw like an interview with the Indian foreign minister a couple of months ago, and it was really difficult for him, really difficult to get the point across to the interviewer that, India is not on the side of evil. It's not on the side of like one or the other. It's just on its own side. Why is that so difficult, and how do you deal with it? Because I believe you must have dealt with that problem over and over, right?
Pascal, I'm really glad you used the word evil. And that's it, because it's such an interesting concept. And I don't want to get too theological about this, but I think we have to enter a worldview, a Weltanschauung, a perspective that exists, which is a worldview that comes out of not maybe all Abrahamic religions, but certainly Christianity. In other words, the idea of evil. I don't, for instance, believe in the idea of evil. I believe in the concept of contradictions. People have very contradictory things. Terrible things happen in the world. They happen for structural reasons. They happen because of individual choices, because people suspend their ethical judgment at crucial moments. But I don't believe in good and evil in an abstract sense. I don't believe, for instance, that the United States government is good and everything it does, therefore, is salvation. Over 1 million people killed in Iraq is not salvation. Just because the United States conducted that war, it doesn't get a free pass, in my opinion. At the same time, I don't consider the United States evil because over 1 million people died in Iraq. I think this is the point of understanding the world for its complexity, the contradictions, different power groups that are in power at different times. They have suspension of ethical judgment. They go into a war ruthlessly, kill a lot of people, and so on. In the same way, I don't think all the adversaries of the United States are evil. I mean, look, until 2007, it was the Western countries that built up the reputation of Vladimir Putin. It was Tony Blair who said that, who went and visited Mr. Putin, went to the opera with him, made a public comment saying, I vouch for Mr. Putin. It was George W. Bush who said, I looked into his eyes and I see an honest man. It was Thomas Friedman, the great sloganeer of the New York Times, the so-called paper of record of the United States. It was Thomas Friedman who wrote, I'm rooting for Putin. Suddenly, when Mr. Putin goes to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, gives a speech saying, we don't believe there should be a single master in the world. He directly confronts the United States. Suddenly, the press starts to say he's evil, he's a dictator, he's this. In fact, let's stop for a minute with the term dictator. It's interesting that the Western press is now calling Mr. Putin a dictator. Who set up the system in Russia that gave Mr. Putin all those powers? It was Western political scientists, State Department officials, non-governmental officials who went to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, who worked to give the presidency enormous powers, because at the time it was their friend Boris Yeltsin. In fact, they even stole an election for Mr. Yeltsin against Gennady Zyuganov, who seemed to have won an election. And even Time magazine reported that the election was stolen. So, you're now saying the oligarchs in Russia, you produced the system that gave those people the ability to privatize all the assets and so on. It's very interesting how this idea of good and evil is mobilized ideologically, used when it benefits people. I frankly don't believe in the philosophy of good versus evil. I believe the world is much more complicated than that. It's a childish approach to the world, if I may say so, even less than theological.
I agree. I agree with you full-heartedly. My question is, why is it possible for let's call it a free society? I mean, the West has its faults and its mistakes, but one of the things that's good is that we can have these debates, and it is relatively free. But how is it possible in a free society to sell to a majority of people that idea of good against evil, and to break and to make the world that simplistic, while the contradictions are just overwhelming, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia is not exactly a beacon of democracy, and Egypt neither, but they are the closest buddies, right, of Europe and the United States. And we have these huge contradictions, right? At the moment, we are asked to believe that, Russia blew up its own pipeline, or that it's a mystery who did that. They're so glaring, so huge, that I wonder, how is it possible to still get a narrative? And we understand the world in narratives, right? As historians, we understand that very well. How is it possible to still sell that narrative and then control the current 6 weeks of politics, right? That politics is constant continuation of 6 weeks that you need to control. And this control seems to be working. And that's how you get so many people rallied behind the idea only a military victory is a good victory in Ukraine, which is the root of all bloody wars. What's your take?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a number of layers. Let's first go to an ideological layer and then to a kind of sociology of knowledge, if you will. First, the ideology. There is a very much undamaged idea that the West is essentially benevolent. Now, God knows where this comes from, because there's a long history of colonialism, genocide, this, that, and the other. You can never call, say, the United States genocidal. Genocide is always for the barbarian. There is a kind of racist way in which the West is always benevolent, regardless of the history. I mean, Belgium and the Belgian King Leopold could have conducted mass genocides in the Congo, but yet it's the Congolese who will be seen as savages and the Belgians who will be seen as civilized. Look at what one of the foreign officials of Europe said. He said Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I mean, for God's sake, man, this is incredible. It's kind of 19th century language. But Europe is a garden, meaning that Europe is benevolent. Europe doesn't do things wrong. I remember reporting the war in Libya. And when NATO command was asked by human rights agencies and the United Nations for evidence that NATO had not committed war crimes, Peter Olson, who was the lead attorney for NATO, wrote a letter, public letter, in which he said that NATO never commits war crimes. It's just a contradiction in terms to put the words NATO and war crimes in a sentence. In other words, there's an ideology of benevolence. That's the first thing. Then there's a sociology of knowledge. You mentioned Noam Chomsky earlier. Mr. Chomsky is a very old friend of mine. We've done a book together. We talk a lot. Chomsky has never really been in mainstream publications talking politics. He was recently published in the New York Times, not about Ukraine, of which he has studied opinions on, not about that, not about the new Cold War against China or the blockade on Cuba, things in which he has very interesting opinions. No, he was published in the New York Times on his opinions about artificial intelligence. He's permitted to talk about that, but he's not even permitted on National Public Radio, any of these forums, to have a discussion about his ideas. And he complains about this all the time in his own wry way. He has 1 million platforms, but they're all often quite small compared to the mainstream platforms. A major American intellectual, a kind of prophet of the American traditions of justice, is not able to speak to the general public. Well, that's interesting. It speaks to the sociology of knowledge. The same people who promoted the war against Iraq continue to be analysts for every single US foreign policy adventure. They will never get, in a sense, set aside. They will never get delegitimized at all. Indeed, the people who participated in constructing that war, George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, they're still brought on television in the United States now to talk about their opinions on Ukraine and so on. But of course, people who have a different view are not brought on. And that says a little bit about the sociology of knowledge. Yes, of course, I agree with you. There's a lot of openness. The stormtroopers don't break through your door to prevent us from having a conversation on a podcast. That's fine. But the big players, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journals, the CNNs, and so on, just don't have a great diversity of opinion. Even things like MSNBC, during the campaign of Bernie Sanders, the most liberal television channel, mainstream channel in the United States, never really made any room for Mr. Sanders and his surrogates. He was off limits. Even Sanders was off limits. So there are, in a sense, lines drawn of what is permissible. Now, you can say whatever you want on the street, and that's fine. But there are no real public channels, for mass communication with people. Now, BBC is interesting in the UK because, after all, that's a government supported channel. It's supported by licensing fees of the public. You'd think, well, in BBC, they should have all kinds of opinions. Talk to Jeremy Corbin. Ask Mr. Corbin how frequently he is allowed to contribute his opinion. When Gary Lineker was recently junked because of his opinions about refugees, he's the great British football player, England's football player, led them to victories all over the place. Gary Lineker was the presenter of a show on football, but he made some tweets complaining about the British government's refugee policy. He was thrown out by BBC. They suspended his show. And Jeremy Corbin went out in public and defended Gary Lineker. Well, shouldn't BBC have invited Jeremy in to have a conversation? After all, former Labour leader. Not a chance. When Keir Starmer said that Jeremy Corbyn is not going to be able to run on a Labour ticket in North Islington, BBC didn't call Jeremy into the studio for a discussion. So there are lines, there's a lot of freedom. Jeremy can say whatever he wants on Twitter and so on. But there are lines when it comes to mass communication that's controlled by big corporations and even by governments. In the case of BBC, there are limits to what's permissible. Now, I understand that, people in power have their own limits, but let's not pretend that it's, Karl Popper's open society.
No, you're right. And it was Noam Chomsky who explained to us more than 30 years ago how the sociology of manufacturing consent works and how this is a self-correcting mechanism that then creates these ships, right, that you can steer. So I just we were going through this whole, the internet is going to revolutionize everything and make an open society. And no, it doesn't. We are still living in a world dominated by states and state narratives and state interests, and we are still the propagandized general public who's then asked to hate another general public over there. and the sociology keeps on spinning. But maybe let me ask you, because this spinning of the war narrative seems not to be working in the third world. I mean, Africa, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South America, they are all kind of rejecting this the stupid narrative of good against evil, and they all see things in a more nuanced way and have these self-interests. And my point is, this like a neutral position is not only good for these countries, it can also help to broker some kind of agreement. Do you also see more good coming out of taking a third position, or do you see dangers in that?
Well, firstly, if you go back 20 years, you'll remember that most countries in the third world were very much opposed to the US war on Iraq. Thabo Mbeki, for instance, then president of South Africa, made public statements condemning the lead to war and so on. So did the Indian government, cautioned and said that Indian soil will not be used, they will not allow overflights from Diego Garcia to Iraq and so on. Countries at the time were also uneasy about a US adventure like that. But they didn't have the kind of confidence, because they were all sort of in the thrall of globalization at that time. Remember, this is less than 10 years after the World Trade Organization was established. You see, today, 20 years later, things have changed. And I think part of the change has to do with the economic emergence of China, and China actually putting institutional alternatives on the table. For instance, the People's Bank of China offering currency swaps gives a country an option, not necessarily to go straight to the IMF and take a structural adjustment loan, or to go to the London or Paris groups, to the creditors, and raise money through an IMF backed project, a kind of program that the IMF sets. Now they have choices, largely because of the emergence of the Belt and Road project and so on. The fact of the choice available to countries has increased the political space for countries to say, look, I'm not interested. Because you see, when Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary of the US, tours Africa and tells countries, you got to vote with us on Ukraine, or you got to send weapons to Ukraine, they're going to look at her and say, Madam Secretary, we're not interested. Because now you can't, in the back room, tell us, if you don't accept what I'm saying politically, we're going to squeeze you on credit. You can't tell us that, because we'll go to the Chinese. There are now alternatives. And I think the reason why you see smaller countries, Namibia, for instance, the prime minister was extremely frank when she spoke at this year's Munich Security Conference. The reason countries can do this now, where they felt slightly less confident 20 years ago, is principally because the economic emergence of China has changed the political dimension. I think the West is completely aware of this and understands this. And, if you're a country like, say, Namibia, and, the Chinese have come and said, look, we're going to invest so many $100 million to build a railroad, to build a hospital, to build whatever. And the United States Embassy says, don't take the deal. The government of Namibia is going to turn to the embassy and say, what's on the table from you? And because of the kind of tax strike in the US, the financialization of the economy, there's simply nothing that the US government can put on the table. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, set up by the Bush administration in 2004 as a contest in a way, it was supposed to be the new Peace Corps or the new Marshall Plan or whatever, is now used as a contest against China. But, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Antony Blinken was recently in Niger, in the Sahel region, and he promised $150 million to the Sahel for humanitarian. That the Chinese can give you in 15 minutes. They can give you that in cash. They have much more surplus available for investments of different kinds. So this gives countries a lot of confidence, Pascal. They are not living in 2002 anymore. They are now in 2023, when there are these choices before them. And I think that accounts for a lot of the public demurrals. Countries saying, look, I don't want to come out in public on this. It's not in my national interest. Why? Because I don't need to. Firstly, you can't strong arm me. I've got options from China. And also, I would like to let you know that we have also older relations with Russia. I think that's another point to put on the table, which is that many of these countries, particularly in Africa, many of them feel grateful not to Russia, but to the Soviet Union for their assistance during the national liberation movement. And that generation is now in power. And many of them that I've spoken to, heads of major offices on the African continent, finance ministers, foreign ministers, and so on. And in two cases, heads of government, they say openly, look, we are grateful to the Soviet Union for its assistance during our liberation movements in the 1960s and 70s. And now we have old friends in Russia. And that is, by the way, also playing a role, which we shouldn't underestimate. Also plays a role in India. Because people may not remember, in 1971, the United States sent the 7th Fleet to threaten India during the Bangladesh Liberation War. And India signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Even the right-wing government in India today references that event and says that, look, we can't abandon the Russians. They helped us in our time of need.
I am afraid that one of the things the US and the West, including the European Union, is going to take away from this situation will be we need more interventionism in these countries that are not in line, and we need to put the Namibians back to knowing which road to tie. And I'm afraid that this will that the US you can see this already, this onslaught against the undecided ones or against the ones who are not with us, right? Do you see danger there, or do you think the choice that is now available will make it easier for the third world to navigate the coming the new Cold War?
I mean, look, I don't want to mock the dangers or minimize the dangers. There are dangers, but what I would say to Washington and Paris and so on is good luck. Paris has just faced a strategic defeat in Burkina Faso and Mali, and I think they will find it difficult going in Niger and Benin. Right now, it looks like Niger and Benin are friendly countries. Those governments are sitting on a razor's edge because the populations are looking towards Burkina Faso and Mali and watching the military governments led by young people with a kind of welfarist orientation to the population. These countries are saying to the French, you're not welcome in the Sahel. And these defeats that are being faced by France from small countries, in terms of their power and influence in the world is considerable. So good luck. I mean, good luck to the United States. I don't think that Blinken's 2 visits, he visited Ethiopia and he visited Niger, I don't think those are going to bear fruit. Ethiopia, anyway, has developed a very antipathic relationship to the West as a consequence of the war against the Tigray people and so on. They were developing a very strong anti-imperialist attitude in Ethiopia. And in Niger, as I said, despite the fact that there's a major drone base costing almost $300 million, the US has a big base, Air Base 201 in Agadez. And also the French have a major uranium mine in the town of Arlit, north of Agadez, toward the Libyan border. Good luck controlling all that, my friends, because 2 things are endangering the control of the West in the Sahel, which is a test case for what we're talking about. Can you reverse the tide? 2 things. One is the jihadi element that was awoken by the West's ridiculous war against Libya, which is there knocking on the doors of the French uranium mine in Arlit. And secondly, the fragility of these governments, because the young military officers in their countries are looking at the presidential palace and saying, you guys are corrupt and we're coming for you. And I think these young officers are not willing to break bread with the French or with the Americans. They are not easily bought off. They have different orientations. And so I don't think that whatever the West wants to do, what are you going to do is have like 50 wars around the world to discipline the third world. It's not going to happen anymore. I think that period has by and large come to a close. And I think the West has to understand that it's merely a group of countries in the world. Nothing special about the United States. It's just one among the 190 odd countries in the world. They need to realize that it's not a city on a hill. It's just a country. Relax. You're just another country. Nothing special about you. It's a little bit like Israel. Nothing special about you. You're just another country. Relax. behave like human beings.
Vijay, you're giving me a lot of hope and a lot of very good vibes. So thank you very much for taking the time to talking to us all.
It's my pleasure, Pascal, really.